Hello again, and we are traveling into the book of Proverbs today, chapters 1 through 3. This for day 181, Monday, June 29th, 2020, here for the Daily Bread Bible Study. Now, the Proverbs are a collection of wisdom literature. It is ascribed to King Solomon, right? The one who is said to have received wisdom in great portions, wisdom beyond his years, beyond his age, from God after asking for the capacity to lead God's people well. And so God blesses him with that, and we will hear some of his wisdom to us, as he talks to his children. Is that kind of the reference that he gives to us? But anyways, we have this wisdom. Some of it will be direct. Some of it will be less direct, using imagery. But all of it will be, in some sense, wisdom. So here in Proverbs 1, we have verse 5 and 6, which say, "Let the wise also hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill, to understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles." Solomon is inviting us to listen, and then the big premise of all of the Psalms is here in verse 7 of chapter 1. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Now, I need to say, that the word fear here is something to interpret a little bit. It's something to put in our modern day context. Fear is not quite in the sense of the literal fear that we have, the flight or fight response that can be triggered when we feel, that biological anxiety. It's more around, the mental side of things, when we are able to intellectualize it and experience that feeling that we get, right? The feeling of awe. And so we have two words in English which essentially capture the same sense of awe. We have the feeling of God can be both an awesome feeling, right, which is a very positive feeling, often a joyful feeling, but it also can be an awful feeling, right? We can feel full of awe in a negative sense, that it just feels bad at times. And this is, how we can approach God. We have a sense of joy for God and God's glory, but also a sense of humility and a sense of hesitation as well too. That God is this being that is far beyond us, far beyond our limitations as humans. It's far beyond any one individual as well too. And so, a lot of this is just humility, which, regardless of any other beliefs about God, humility is a very important thing that keeps us able to connect with others and learn and grow here in our lives. So now I will say that it's important to finish verse number 7, which this idea is kind of connected with the continuation of the verse, which says, "Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So we as humans always have something more to learn, and respecting God enough to listen will allow us to accept some of the wisdom that is sought to be revealed here in this book of Proverbs. So moving on, King Solomon warns about empty promises of the wicked. In verse 14 of chapter 1, it says, "Throw in your lot among us, and we will have one purse, say the wicked. My child, do not walk in their way. Keep your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they hurry to shed blood." We're additionally warned by King Solomon in verse 19 that greed takes away the life of its possessors, which is very poetic and profound. We can search for all sorts of wealth. We can try and make money and to increase our net worth. And all of these pursuits, in some sense, our possessions can try and take away our life and make our life all about our possessions. And so it's important to balance that as we seek to grow, as we seek to provide for others, to remember that life is more than just our possessions and our wealth. In Proverbs 125, it says, has a personification of wisdom who's calling out into the street saying, "You have ignored my counsel." And so what wisdom will do is laugh at your calamity in verse 26. Moving on to Proverbs chapter 2, we have images again of wisdom, of God storing up wisdom like food in a storehouse, of God acting as a shield for those who follow and hear from God, and God also saving people from adultery, which is kind of a path of destruction. Now, this last part is specifically interesting as King Solomon was, in some sense, a product of adultery, right? Now, King David and his mother Bathsheba, David took Bathsheba away from Uriah, had Uriah plotted and killed, and it was a deep, deep dysfunction around the adultery of King David with Bathsheba. The child eventually died born to them, but they had another child, and one of those children, or more children, I should say, one of those children was King Solomon. And so I wonder if Solomon's reflecting in some sense of his own family dysfunction, the way that King David's dysfunction led to the latter part of his life, leading to a lot of conflict and lack of peace within his own family. So Solomon, maybe learning from it, maybe not, is accused of having a lot of women, a lot of concubines and wives, who led his heart away from God the older he got, as he built temples to these foreign gods to worship them. So, it's just interesting connection here to save them from adultery, but yet feeling susceptible to it in his life. In Proverbs chapter 3, I selected verse 3, which says, "Do not let loyalty and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart." So this is the opposite of that metaphor of adultery. It's loyalty and faithfulness, especially to God. Verse 5, it says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight," which speaks to me, the wisdom that comes from not listening to my emotions all the time, right? I am challenged by my emotions. Sometimes I just feel either threatened or defensive. I shut down, or other times I feel aggressive and attack. And these feelings are real feelings that we feel as humans. They're feelings that come over us and can subvert our logic. And so the idea is that if we repeat God's wisdom and understanding, if we hear it enough and internalize it, then God's reason and wisdom will overcome our human emotions that can get the best of us at times. The imagery here in verse 12 is of a parent teaching their children what is right so that they can have agency in the midst of challenges, which is my hope for my kids, that I can be able to raise them to not have to hear my words all the time, but to reflect on the words and the wisdom that I try and impart to them, the wisdom that God is trying to guide me with and their lives with, and that they can be able to distinguish wisdom from foolishness themselves. So in verse 12 it says, "The Lord reproves the one he loves, as a father the son whom he delights." So having consequences for our actions help us to learn the difference between right and wrong, and without some sort of correction, we just go wild. We choose what we think is in our best interest, but it really can be hurting ourselves. Here in the end, as we close, we have wisdom described as a tree of life. Trees provide a lot for humanity, and especially thriving trees are a gift. In verse 27 of chapter 3, it says, "Do not withhold good from those whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it." This is, in some sense, creating a trustworthy world. It's being a trustworthy neighbor. It's also being a good neighbor, even in the midst of neighbors who, can be unwise as well, too. Your neighbor might, not deserve it by your standards, but at the same time, it's God's wisdom to give, and to give generously, and to give good where good is needed. It's also important, too, to not slander our neighbors, to speak and explain kindly our neighbor's actions in the kindest way possible. This is one of the explanations of the Ten Commandments that our Lutheran Catechism, Small Catechism by Martin Luther, helps to explain and illuminate. It's another good form of Proverbs or instruction. I definitely recommend you check it out, Luther's Small Catechism. So anyways, I hope you are enjoying this. Thanks for joining me for the Psalms and into the Proverbs here. And we look forward to more of God's wisdom that God will impart through King Solomon.